For years, teams of scientists have responded to oil spills to study and limit their impact on the environment. They've learned much about man's cleanup techniques and nature's powerful ability to recover from a spill. Today, we're going to look at the contributions made by a few of the hundreds of scientists who responded to one familiar oil spill, the 1989 Valdez spill in Prince William Sound, Alaska. But first, let's take a quick look at the circumstances of the accident itself on March 24, 1989. The Exxon Valdez, a supertanker as long as 3 football fields, left port with a shipment of more than 1.2 million barrels of oil, or in excess of 50 million gallons. Shortly after midnight, it grounded on Bligh Reef.
We have the Exxon Valdez aground at Bligh Reef. Request you proceed for possible assist. Over.
It was the first major accident after almost 9,000 tanker trips from the port of Valdez. Although there have been about 3 dozen larger spills around the world, it was the largest ever in the United States. About 20% of the cargo of the Exxon Valdez spilled into Prince William Sound, about 11 million gallons of oil. The remaining oil was pumped into 3 other tankers in a process called lightering. The spilled oil drifted on the water for 3 days before it began to reach the shore. By then, most of the lighter components of the crude oil had evaporated, making it less toxic to the environment. Exxon, the state of Alaska, and the federal government rushed scientists to the scene. Among them were biologists, chemists, physicists, zoologists, wildlife physiologists, and veterinarians. 2 of the immediate concerns they tackled were helping the oiled wildlife and removing the oil from the environment. Let's turn to the wildlife situation first. Mammals living in the frigid water of the Sound protect themselves from the cold in various ways. For example, sea otters keep warm by trapping air in their extremely dense pelts. But when the otter pelt is coated with oil, it loses its ability to hold warmth.
And that's why it's so important to get these animals out of the water or out of an oil spill as quickly as possible, because in a matter of hours it can lose so much body heat that it goes into a hypothermic state.
Dr. Williams from the Naval Ocean Systems Center in Hawaii and wildlife physiologist Randall Davis from Texas A&M University led the unprecedented effort to rescue, rehabilitate, and study oiled sea otters in Prince William Sound. With Exxon, state, and federal support, they set up 3 emergency treatment centers. After recovering oiled otters, rescuers brought them into the centers for treatment. Scientists knew from previous spills that the best way to clean them was as close as your kitchen sink, regular dishwashing liquid. The scrubbing removed the otters' natural oils along with the crude, so they needed some time for their pelts to return to normal. How are the animals doing? To answer that, the veterinarians and physiologists relied on tried and true scientific methods, observation and measurement. They watched the animals closely in their saltwater holding tanks. How was their swimming? Lively? Were their pelts repelling water? Were the animals grooming properly? And finally, how were they eating? Sea otters have voracious appetites and can consume the equivalent of 25% of their body weight in food every day. To quantify the animal's recovery, the scientists measured how much food each otter consumed and how much weight they gained. The experts also took the temperature of the animals to see how their washed pelts were retaining body heat. And they conducted blood and urine tests to measure the otter's internal health. Those observations and measurements confirmed that the otters could in fact bounce back from oiling.
We received about 357 sea otters and rehabilitated about 63% of them. And we're very pleased and proud of that figure. It was the first time that large numbers of sea otters had ever been oiled and brought into a rehabilitation facility.
In late summer of 1989, 200 of the rescued otters were doing well enough to be returned to the wild, an unprecedented number. Several sea otter pups born in the shelters and other ailing otters were just not ready for the wild and were sent to seaquariums around the country. Sea otters aren't the only animals vulnerable to oil spills. There was also concern for the bald eagles in the spill area. At 5,000, it contains one of the largest populations of eagles in the world. Bald eagle specialist Marge Gibson came to capture eagles in the summer of 1989 and assess their health. Ms. Gibson has been rehabilitating birds of prey for over 20 years.
I was hired by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service because of my extensive eagle trapping experience and my interest in toxins for birds of prey.
Teams used a wire snare baited with a fish to safely capture 113 bald eagles from the most heavily oiled areas of Prince William Sound.
He's caught.
The birds were taken aboard boats, and once again, scientific observation and measurement came into play. To make the birds easier and safer to handle, the scientists secured their claws and wrapped them in soft flannel pajamas. Then they conducted a physical exam.
See, he has a little oil around in here, and this is oil. It feels...
Was there any oil on the eagle's feathers, any on the beak or in the oral cavity that would indicate it ate oiled prey? Was the bird active or lethargic?
The birds that we caught, some seemed unaffected. Some seemed to have just a very small trailing of oil on the tail. And I suspect that we were maybe seeing natural selection in process. We forget that these birds have very, very keen eyesight, and they're not stupid. They're not going to be fishing where it's oily.
But even the best scientist cannot see what's going on inside the bird. So they took blood samples to test for anemia or low red cell count, plus liver and kidney function. Overall, of the 113 captured eagles, 98 were released within a half hour. The other 15 birds were sent to a raptor rehabilitation center in Anchorage for further treatment. 4 other centers treated 1,600 seabirds, such as murres and gulls, which spend nearly their entire lives on the water and can be trapped by floating oil. The efforts of these rescue and rehabilitation workers helped save many oiled birds and wildlife. Unfortunately, many others died. It's difficult to know exactly how many, but search parties did recover 36,000 dead seabirds and about 1,000 otter carcasses. Fortunately, scientists know that the area contains large populations able to overcome these losses. For example, a federal study several years ago estimated 67 million seabirds living in the Sound and Gulf of Alaska, and 16,000 sea otters were believed to be living in the area at the time of the spill. Other sea mammals living in the Sound, whales, dolphins, seals, and sea lions, are less vulnerable to the effects of oil. Unlike sea otters, those other mammals use a thick layer of fat to keep warm, rather than air trapped in their pelt. And what about the fish that the mammals and birds eat? Scientists know from observations of previous oil spills around the world that open water fish are rarely at risk because little oil gets into the water column where they live. Let's move on to our second area of focus, the removal of the oil from the environment. To map where the oil had landed, scientists surveyed the shoreline from the air and by foot. They determined that about 15% of the 9,000 miles of shoreline in Prince William Sound and the western Gulf of Alaska were affected by the spill. They also found that almost 3/4 of the affected shores were mostly bedrock. The other quarter were made up of cobblestones or finer sediments. This information was very important in determining the best cleanup method for each type of shoreline. Some scientists felt that the environment should be left to handle a spill by itself. Evaporation, sunlight, wave action, and bacterial action all are known to remove or degrade oil naturally over time. But most scientists favored using more aggressive techniques. A Coast Guard official serving as federal on-scene coordinator approved all cleanup plans.
Exxon's using the methods and the means that we have recommended, we, the various interest groups. And they certainly have mobilized a large task force. Go up in Prince William Sound, it looks like a miniature Normandy invasion.
Many different cleanup techniques were used, but the most common was cold water flushing. Crews sprayed cold water to move the oil from the beaches and into the shallow water, where waiting skimmers could pick it up. Later, the oil weathered and became harder to remove with cold water. Federal officials in charge of the cleanup directed a switch to warm water washing on some beaches. Scientists knew that all the cleanup methods, and especially warm water washing, could harm some tiny beach organisms. However, not removing the bulk oil could jeopardize the larger species which use the intertidal zone. Marine biologist and international oil spill expert Paul Kingston wrote, "The importance of wildlife in Prince William Sound was of course a compelling reason for adopting such cleanup methods in 1989. Wildlife creatures were given a very high priority in Alaska, and we feel this was justified. By the end of 1989, the emergency cleanup had achieved a primary scientific goal: to accelerate nature's own cleaning process. In addition to 1989's field work, scientists were busy in the laboratory testing various beach cleaning alternatives. One promising technique that saw widespread use was bioremediation. Bioremediation uses naturally occurring bacteria to remove oil on and below beach surfaces. Shortly after the tanker grounded, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and Exxon began an extensive bioremediation testing program. Scientists have long known that hydrocarbons, the chemical elements of oil, exist naturally in many ecosystems, including Prince William Sound. Pine sap, for instance, contains hydrocarbon. Petroleum also seeps naturally from the ocean floor. And biologists have identified an entire class of naturally occurring microbes that consume these hydrocarbons and break them down into harmless substances. The question facing scientists like Russ Chianelli, Steve Hinton, and Ed Stiefel was how to encourage the Sound's microbes to consume more oil faster.
I remember being very surprised when you guys told me that the way to attack this spill was not only to use the natural organisms that were occurring in Prince William Sound, but to just fertilize them like you would your garden, add nitrogen and phosphorus and other trace elements. And I thought, gee, yeah, that's really kind of an obvious thing to do, and it's so simple and natural that it has to be one of the best solutions for up there.
There's a natural population, and a very small percentage can utilize a hydrocarbon. When you introduce this hydrocarbon, you give that population a selective advantage, and they increase in number with respect to the indigenous population.
The scientists simulated Prince William Sound beaches in the laboratory and tried out various combinations of fertilizers. After further field tests, using blocked-off plots to make comparisons, the EPA and Exxon found that two fertilizers would do the trick. One was a liquid, and the other a granular type like what you might use on your lawn. Both were determined to be safe for plants and wildlife if used properly. Here's how bioremediation works. The fertilizers, shown here in green, add nitrogen and phosphorus to the environment. With a balance of nutrients, the fertilizers stimulate the growth of native bacteria, shown in purple. More bacteria ingest more oil. After the microbes consume all the degradable hydrocarbons, they return to their original numbers and natural hydrocarbon food sources. Studies found that bioremediation fertilizing speeded up the rate of natural biodegradation of oil by a factor of 3 to 5 times. Some 74 miles of shoreline received bioremediation fertilizing before 1989's cleanup was suspended in mid-September due to the danger posed by winter storms. As scientists had predicted, those storms helped scour the beach surfaces. In the spring of 1990, a new round of shoreline surveys found many signs of recovery and much less oil. With surface oil nearly gone, scientists especially focused their efforts on oil that had seeped down beneath the surface of the beach. In some cases, tilling equipment was brought in to expose the buried oil for better cleaning by man and nature. The scientists also resumed bioremediation fertilizing with special emphasis on shorelines with subsurface oil. Scientist Jim Clark of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency studied the results.
Well, a lot's been learned on our ability to help Mother Nature. The main thing we learned is Mother Nature degrades oil more rapidly than we ever thought. Bioremediation will continue to be developed for oil spills using fertilizers and other kinds of chemical techniques. And what we're learning, we're also expanding into hazardous waste research and other pollution problems.
By the spring of 1991, survey teams found oil residue on less than 1% of the 9,000 miles of shoreline in the spill-affected area. Bioremediation and manual cleaning continued in specific locations where federal, state, and Exxon scientists believed it would provide a net benefit to the environment. In the spring of 1992, survey teams found that man's efforts and natural processes, such as wave and bacterial action, had succeeded in removing nearly all of the oil. Bioremediation and manual cleanup were performed in a few locations in conjunction with these surveys. In June 1992, the federal on-scene coordinator declared the cleanup effort ended.
The cleanup is finished. We have cleaned all the shorelines to the point where if we do more work, we would cause more harm than good.
The improvement in shoreline conditions since 1989 has been dramatic. For example, on Knight Island, the progress from 1989 to 1990 to 1991 to 1992 is clear to see. In addition to their efforts to help oiled wildlife and clean oiled shorelines, scientists also directed their attention to assessing the outlook for the Prince William Sound environment. Hundreds of scientists took tens of thousands of water, sediment, and biological samples. These were then analyzed in labs around the country. The goal was to measure the concentration of hydrocarbons remaining in the environment and its organisms, and thereby gauge any lasting effects of the spilled oil. The massive science program focused on many areas, including fisheries, water quality, and plant and animal life. Let's examine the fisheries first. This is an example of how scientists compared quantitative data from oiled locations against historical records of the same areas. The Prince William Sound pink salmon harvest shows just how species populations can vary from year to year. The last 10 years show some wide swings, with 1990 and 91's catches being the best two ever. That's especially noteworthy because of the pink salmon's life cycle. The fish harvested in 1990 swam through the spill area as juveniles at the time of the accident. Those pink salmon caught in 1991 were being laid as eggs in the summer immediately after the accident. That would indicate little if any long-term effect of oil on the pink salmon. But beyond fish catches, there is only limited baseline scientific data on the Prince William Sound environment before the Valdez spill. In other words, only limited means of comparing then and now. So how else can scientists analyze the impacts of oil? They can compare measurements taken after a spill against accepted standards. That's exactly what happened in investigating the water quality of Prince William Sound. Scientists know that oil tends to float on the water's surface with very little dispersion downward to where fish and other marine organisms live. Still, to fully evaluate the condition of the water column, experts took samples immediately after the spill and over the following months. Overall, more than 5,000 samples were analyzed.
Water samples were taken at the surface in various water depths with specialized water sampling equipment throughout Prince William Sound and in the Gulf of Alaska. The samples were shipped back to the laboratory and analyzed for 4 different types of petroleum hydrocarbons.
They found that the levels of aromatic hydrocarbons, those are the most toxic components of the spilled oil, went up slightly right after the spill, but quickly returned to background levels. Throughout, the levels stayed well within the state of Alaska's acceptable standards for those elements in marine waters.
The story is essentially closed, that the hydrocarbons are gone and have remained low for a long period of time and won't come back. We shouldn't expect any long-term residual effects on water column organisms.
Scientists also studied the status of plants and animals living in the intertidal or shoreline zones. Here, their technique was to mark off sections of beach and survey the populations and types of species present. The teams then compared the measurements taken on oiled shorelines versus those taken in unoiled areas of the Sound. We've seen how scientists used quantitative measurements to assess the environmental recovery. The scientists also look beyond numbers to the qualitative evidence that is clear to a trained eye. Dr. Robert Clark is a British zoologist who has studied the scientific literature on the impact of oil spills throughout the world and has published many extensive reports on the subject. He first visited the shores of Prince William Sound soon after the oil spill to compare its recovery to that of other spills.
Once you've got rid of the oil, the natural environment will bounce back in a very short time, a matter of a few years. And it's that perception which is very difficult to get across to the general public, who are left with images from television of oily birds, filthy oil all over the rocks, and people trying to clear it up and so on.
Dr. Clark and his colleagues, Dr. Paul Kingston and Dr. Jennifer Baker, returned to the Sound in 1990 to observe an abundance of sea otters and thriving colonies of seabirds.
The marine environment is a continuous environment, and all around the shores that were impacted, of course, there were shores that weren't. The animals that live on those shores and the plants that live on those shores all reproduce by putting their young into the water to float about to find and colonize new areas. Well, the new areas, of course, would be the areas that were impacted by the oil.
In July 1991, the 3 British scientists again came to those impacted areas and observed many more signs of recovery, including massive quantities of mussels, barnacles, snails, and plant life.
The shores that we've seen have a good diversity of plants and animals of the type we would expect on those shores, and they're healthy and they're reproducing.
Other scientists also made qualitative observations of the Sound's recovery from one year to the next. They found the environment to be clean, and they spotted many new arrivals. To assess the recovery progress of sea otters, Terry Williams returned to previously oiled areas in 1990 to see how the animals were doing.
To come up here a year later and see the animals swimming in the Sound and to see them eating their food and raising pups is a very encouraging, wonderful experience.
Eagle specialist Marge Gibson also returned for follow-up observations in 1990.
My focus this year was on the areas that were oiled in 1989. And even in those areas, the nest that I saw frequently had 2 chicks per nest. And this is just an incredible sign that things are going well with the habitat.
And those eagles have a bumper crop of salmon to eat. There was another exceptional Prince William Sound pink salmon harvest in 1991, so abundant that millions of pounds were given to needy people in the former Soviet Union. Both the quantitative and qualitative observations give strong evidence that the environment in the spill-impacted area is rebounding rapidly and that the outlook for full recovery is excellent.
An extensive cleanup work was done by all agencies, all people, and you take a look at it now, you can see the marine growth coming back in the intertidal area. Just a matter of time before it comes back just about where it was before the spill.
As we've seen, scientists played an important role in helping oiled wildlife, cleaning oiled shoreline, and assessing the outlook for the recovery of the Prince William Sound environment. Their work, both in the laboratory and the field, has furthered our understanding of the environment, enhanced man's ability to respond to a spill, and helped speed the recovery of Prince William Sound.